It was the night of Nadifa's 19th birthday. A large fire burning behind her as she stood on the edge of the dark, swampy forest, with nothing more than the clothes on her back and a small satchel of necessities. As was tradition within her family, tonight she would embark on her final spirit walk, a rite of passage which symbolized maturity, as well as an opportunity for her to fortify her connections with nature, her healing prowess, and herself. She came from an extensive line of spiritual healers within her village, a remote little place nestled deep into the swamps of Eden 6. Her family was renowned within the area for their near miraculous methods of healing severe afflictions, and Nadifa felt the weight of the expectation she was meant to meet. Despite her worries, though, she'd give one more glance back towards her parents before setting off, her form quickly enveloped by the dark trees. On the 7th night of her walk, as she stared up towards the stars, the entire universe would seem to light up in a quick flash of light, sparks of energy arcing through the sky. Nadifa could practically feel it all around her, coursing across her body. Though as quickly as it came, it would leave. But, seemingly not without a parting gift, she felt a lingering, burning sensation begin to spread upward along her arm, a faint, red glow visible underneath her sleeve. As she rolled it up to her shoulder, she would see patterns of red begin to flow along her arm, twisting and turning as it painted fantastical markings across her skin. During the next week of her walk, as Nadifa's newfound power would manifest, she learned how to channel the consuming, wicked nature of its energy into quite the unique source of healing. Although often requiring power to be siphoned from one place to another, she'd quickly learn that the local fauna was quite useful for that aspect. After Nadifa returned to her village, her reputation quickly grew, her name able to be found even far outside this single corner of Eden 6, with stronger and stronger individuals from across the galaxy seeking out her aid. Yet, an insatiable urge developed within her, compelling her to absorb portions of their strength as she healed them, blurring the line between selflessness and self-interest. Slowly, Nadifa's bond with her own power was outgrowing her bond with her lineage, as her desire for strength would drive her to actively seek out even more powerful patients. Amidst this growing corruption, an ancient call beckoned from the depths of her fracturing psyche, urging her towards a new destiny. A sisterhood formed of more power than even she could comprehend.
And here she is, Nadifa the Siren, the Eden 6 shaman who is slowly being corrupted by the power she gained after the death of Tyreen. Now, I don't want to talk too much about the specifics in the way of design, as I'm not at all a person who super understands character design, but in short, I tried to keep the sort of Mad Max meets modern to futuristic fashion sense of the Borderlands universe, but also throwing in some more traditional shamany / witch doctory imagery to make it look a little bit more behind the times, seeing as she's supposed to be from just a tiny little swamp village, which, keeping with that theme, is where the raggediness and the dirt comes from. And yes, there may have been some inspiration from Tia Dalma. As for a couple other details, with her face specifically, I did want to kind of have that line of just kind of starting to lose it. Giving her the crazy eyes, the big old toothy grin, but not so much as she's like totally gone just yet. Along with, I felt it was important that while not making her like just completely emaciated, I did kind of want her to look a little bit malnourished, not only only because swamp cuisine probably ain't the best, but also as a bit of storytelling just to showcase that she is a leech and that she needs to siphon to sustain herself. And the mast on her hip is a design element that I am actually quite happy with, as the plan for that would be to kind of have it work into her gameplay with a lot of her action still animations. And here, while it is designed after a jabber, that design would actually change to reflect her equipped mark, which we will get into shortly. But finally here, I would love to just give a huge thanks to Sarah, aka Mixed Swoons on Instagram, for giving my Jumbled Thoughts actual form with this piece. She did an incredible job, and I would highly recommend maybe getting some art from her yourself if you're in the market. There will be a link in the description of this video. Before we get into her skills, I'd like to quickly go over my thought process when designing Nadifa. I've always liked the idea of having a sort of supportive style of character in Borderlands, and while there have been supportive abilities, we've never really gotten a full-on proper support class, and there's good reason for this. The problem here is that in a game like Borderlands, it's very difficult to balance both offense and defense as is, and it becomes even more complicated when your defensive ability is variable to the amount of players in your lobby. So to combat this, while Nadifa does have a lot in the way of defense and supportive ability, much of it is tied to her playing quite offensively, meaning that if she wants to keep her defense up, she needs to also keep her offense up. And when it comes to supporting allies, many of her stronger supportive abilities will take resources away from herself. Along with that, to allow for easier balance between solo and group play, there are a couple of ways in which she can create allies to still utilize ally-reliant effects even when solo. But in short, Nadifa is a character which thrives in the chaos of battle and the upkeep of bloodshed. You need to constantly be putting yourself in harm's way to get the absolute most out of Nadifa's best defense. That being said though, I also wanted Nadifa to have multiple and varied ways to play her, which was definitely a very core consideration when coming up with each and every one of her abilities and skills, as build variety is what I believe to be the single most important thing in a Vault Hunter. Also keep in mind that all numbers that are present are pretty arbitrary and are used more as a placeholder to get across the general idea and power level of that specific skill, and not necessarily thought about within the context of other skills. These numbers were also thought about within the context of specifically BL3's endgame numbers. If I were to have created an entire damage formula to crunch numbers with and to try to balance things, it would have been a little bit overkill for the purpose of this video, which of course is just fun. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the skill trees of Nadifa the Siren. So let's first get into action skills and augments, starting with our red tree. Our action skill for this tree is Phase Drain. Nadifa channels her siren energy through her body and releases it as large spectral tendrils, which will constantly attach to all enemies within Phase Drain's radius, and that have line of sight to Nadifa, dealing damage and healing her for a small portion of that damage dealt. Damage dealt by Phase Drain counts as its own status effect while also being able to apply status effects of her attuned element. You can think of this as like kind of a mix of Ramatra ult from Overwatch and Swain ult from League of Legends, but you know, just mashed together and made more Borderlandsy. The element for this tree is Burning Remedy, which is incendiary damage, and to our augments we start with Preserved, where when an enemy dies with a drain beam attached, they have a 30% increased chance to husk. Captivate, which reduces the movement speed of enemies attached by Phase Drain by 20%, and Banshee's Call. Upon activating Phase Drain, release a large nova dealing damage of Nadifa's attuned element and instantly generating 10 stacks of leech per enemy hit. Our red tree, or our voodoo tree, focuses heavily on status effects, elemental damage, and generally burning down enemies for Nadifa to sustain herself through the damage she takes from channeling incredible power through herself. And starting us off as a heavy core focus with this tree is Leech for 4 points. Dealing status damage generates stacks of leech. For each stack of leech, Nadifa gains 0.25 up to 1% action still duration and 0.75 up to 3% status effect damage. Nadifa will also take 0.25 to 1 damage per second per stack of leech. This is flat damage, meaning that if she has 300 stacks of leech, she will take 300 damage per second. This self-damage is doubled during Phase Drain. Leech does stack infinitely, however stacks will decay faster the more stacks that Nadifa has, meaning that you'll need to constantly upkeep that status effect damage as much as you can if you want to get the absolute most out of this. It is worth keeping in mind that anything that interacts with Leech is balanced around the idea of having around 300 to 400 stacks within late game fights. You would be able to get more than this, however that would require some very optimal gameplay and some very optimal building. To complement Leech though, with our 1 point is Agony, causing Nadifa to heal for 3% of her max HP per tick from all currently applied status effects. Coming to tier 2, we start with Curse for 5 points, which increases status effect damage and duration by 4 up to 20%. Nadifa's attuned element is further increased by an additional 5%. Hot Hands for 1 point. Nadifa gains 3% increased reload speed and fire rate for each active status effect. And Rejuvenation for 5 points. Nadifa's allies gain 5 to 25% of her healing from agony. This does scale off of the healing that she herself is receiving from that 3% of her max health, meaning that Rejuvenation's healing for her allies will scale with the amount of HP that Nadifa herself has. On to tier 3, we start with Soul Siphon for 5 points. Whenever Nadifa does a husk, she restores 5% of her action still duration and gains 5 bonus stacks of leech. Action still damage is increased by 6 to 30%. Then we have Wings of Wrath for 1 point, which is a siren power kill skill. Tentacles writhe free from Nadifa's back, periodically lashing out towards nearby enemies to deal elemental damage. These tentacles gain 3% increased damage and chance to apply a status effect of her attuned element per stack of leech, though also deals double her leech self-damage per lash. Self-damage is increased to triple during phase drain. Wings of Wrath would start at a pretty low damage and status effect chance, as the idea of this skill is that it drastically scales in power the longer a fight goes on and the more stacks of leech that she gains during it, going from borderline worthless to actual substantial supplementary damage. And then Invoke for 5 points. Nadifa's allies within the radius of phase drain will have their weapons imbued with her chosen element while phase drain is active. Damage dealt by their weapons has a 5 to 25% chance to apply a status effect of Nadifa's attuned element. On to tier 4, we start with Bark Skin for 5 points, in which Nadifa gains 2 to 10% bonus max HP and 1 to 5% damage reduction per 40 stacks of leech, which of course means that these are stacking bonuses, and she will gain more the longer that the fight goes on. And Speed Demon, another 5 point skill, where Nadifa gains 0.8 to 4% bonus movement speed per currently applied status effect. While phase drain is active, allies within the radius of phase drain will gain half of this bonus. On to tier 5, we have Back Against the Wall for 3 points. Nadifa deals from 0.66 to 2% more elemental damage for each ally nearby, and 0.33 to 1% for each enemy. The radius of this is meant to reflect having around maybe 10 or so enemies around herself, meaning she would get around 20% bonus damage from that portion of it, plus the ally bonus. However, in very heavy mobbing sections, this could definitely go much higher. And Corrupted Soul for 1 point, which is a kill skill. When an enemy inflicted by status effects dies, a Corrupted Soul is summoned. The Corrupted Soul holds all statuses applied to the previous enemy and seeks out the next nearest enemy, applying all statuses contained. Nadifa gains 5 bonus stacks of leech for each transferred status effect. And finally, for our capstone of this tree, Rage and Grace, which of course is a 1 point skill and is a siren power. For Rage, when Nadifa enters Fight for Your Life, leech stacks are consumed, later to be released as a burst of skill damage in a large radius around herself once she gets back up, the damage of which scaling with the amount of leech stacks that were consumed. And Grace, if Nadifa consumed at least 350 stacks, she will instantly revive, activating Rage. Grace has a 90-second cooldown. Onto Blue Tree, our action skill is Husk Explode. Nadifa instantly drains the health from any unnamed enemy, healing herself from a percentage drained and turning the enemy into a Husk Bomb. Husk Bombs explode after a short period of time or when shot, dealing splash damage and grenade damage in an area of her attuned element. The initial drain damage scales from action still damage bonuses. Basic enemies will instantly husk no matter the damage taken, though badass enemies, to turn them into a Husk Bomb, will need to be killed by the initial drain damage. Badass Husk Bombs deal significantly increased damage. The element for this tree is Witch's Waste, which is radiation damage, and our augments are Gas Leak. The explosion from Nadifa's Husk Bombs leave behind a lingering cloud, dealing constant damage of her attuned element. This cloud is able to apply status effects. Contagion, enemies killed by a Husk Bomb will become a guaranteed husk, and Ash Master. Nadifa gains an additional charge of Husk Explode. Blue Tree, or the Siphoner Tree, focuses mostly on splash damage and grenade usage, though also provides many tools for Nadifa to control the battlefield around herself. Starting off at tier 1, we have Excite. Gun damage is increased by 5 to 25% for each active husk. Now, this is Nadifa's only source of gun damage and is incredibly variable in the power that it can provide, which is why it is a tier 1. This skill is able to pretty much go from being pretty good to absolutely batshit broken when focusing harder into creating more and more husks. As I said, this is intentionally a tier 1 skill, which is meant to drastically scale in power the more you focus points elsewhere into maximizing it. However, being tier 1, it is available as a good damage boost to all other builds, even those that don't. And our other skill in this tier, Pressure Points, for 5 points, which increases critical hit damage by 6 to 30%. When an enemy is killed with a critical hit, Nadifa gains increased reload speed by 10 to 50% for a short duration. This is a lot of reload speed, and it is kinda meant to be, as this is supposed to be a very short duration, pretty much meant to be used almost instantly after scoring that kill just to top off very quickly. On to tier 2, we have Bog Bombs for 5 points, which simply increases grenade damage by 6 to 30%. However, this is a little bit better than it would seem on the surface, as of course this also increases the damage of Hush Splode since that gets grenade damage bonuses. Then we have Pocket of Holding for 3 points, which increases the max amount of grenades that Nadifa can hold by 2 to 6. And a still synergizing very well with this is Pestilence for 5 points, which increases splash damage by 1 to 5% per missing grenade. This does mean that with Bog Bombs at 19 max grenades, you could have up to 95% splash damage when you have no more grenades left, and your final grenade thrown would get up to 90% increased splash damage. So pretty good skill. On to tier 3, we have Mummify for 5 points. Enemies that are killed with a status effect applied have a 5 to 25% increased chance to husk. The next to that, we have Feast for 1 point, which just simply doubles the amount of ammo and health drops that you get from dusting a husk. And finally in this tier, Dust to Dust for 3 points. Shooting through a husk amps all projectiles by 80 to 240%. The husk of course gets dusted after use. Dust to Dust projectiles have an increased chance to husk enemies that are killed by them. On to tier 4, we have Dr. Discomfort for 3 points. Enemies damaged by Nadifa's action skill are weakened, dealing 5 to 15% less damage, and Force of Will for 1 point, which is a siren power. Ground Slam now creates an explosion, dealing elemental damage of Nadifa's attuned element. Tier 5, we have Volatile Concoction for 1 point, which is another siren power, causing all husks to create a small explosion when they get dusted. This explosion will also chain through other nearby husks. This chain can also be triggered with a Hush Splode detonation. And Rite of Ruin for 5 points. Dusting husks grants stacks of ruin to Nadifa, increasing splash damage by 0.6 to 3% and movement speed by 1 to 5% per stack. Badass husks grant 3 stacks, and ruin can stack up to 10 times but does decay quite quickly. And finally, for our capstone of this tree is Spellcraft for of course 1 point. This is also a siren power. Nadifa imbues her grenades, gaining different effects based on her currently attuned element. For radiation, throwing a grenade irradiates Nadifa for 6 seconds. While irradiated, Nadifa is surrounded by an aura of radiation, dealing constant damage to nearby enemies and a smaller amount of damage to herself. Additionally, while irradiated, any grenades thrown are duplicated while traveling through the air. Corrosive causes a corrosive puddle to form under the impact site of her grenades, drastically slowing all enemies within and dealing constant corrosive damage to them. All grenades bounce twice, exploding with each impact. And Incendiary summons a fiery phoenix familiar, targeting nearby enemies and spitting fireballs towards them. Fireballs have no splash radius but benefit from splash and grenade damage. This phoenix also counts as an ally. The duration will also reset with each grenade thrown. And our green tree, the action still is Imbue. Nadifa imbues a targeted enemy with a fraction of her power, frying their mind and causing them to enrage. Imbued subjects will target whatever is closest to them, including Nadifa and her allies, though imbued subjects will draw aggro from nearby enemies and will target the last enemy to hit it. Nadifa and allies can only deal gun damage to the imbued. Imbued subjects slowly husk as they fight, causing them to deal more damage but move slower until fully husking. The more siren power Nadifa has, the stronger imbued subjects are, and the longer the husking process takes. Imbued subjects count as allies. The element for this tree is Bog Water, which is corrosive damage. And for our augments, we start with Mark of the Jabber. Imbued subjects are marked by the Jabber, gaining a shield bar equal to a third of their max HP and allowing them to hold onto and fire their weaponry, gaining bonuses from weapon damage. Every third shot is amped for 100% bonus damage. Mark of the Saurian, imbued subjects are marked by the Saurian, gaining an armor bar equal to half of their max HP, along with bonus movement speed and melee damage. Every third hit is a slash, causing the target to begin bleeding for 150% of the subject's melee damage. This effect stacks. And Mark of the Swamp Queen. Imbued subjects are marked by the Swamp Queen, gaining an extra HP bar and causing every melee hit to create a small explosion centered on the target, dealing splash damage and elemental damage of Nadifa's attuned element. And And finally onto Nadifa's green tree, or Puppet Master, a tree focused on buffing, controlling, and even creating allies. While this is the most supportive focused tree, it's important to keep in mind that Nadifa rarely does anything which doesn't also benefit herself. And starting off at tier 1, we have Bitter Remedy for 5 points, causing status effects to deal damage half as often, but deal 105 to 125% bonus damage per tick. This will slow down the rate at which your status effects deal damage, but you will receive drastically increased damage per tick. And next is To the End, a 5-point kill steal, in which Nadifa and her allies gain 4 to 20% fire rate, accuracy, and melee speed. On to tier 2, we have Witch Ward for 5 points. When Nadifa's shield takes damage, 20 to 100% of the lost shield is returned to her as max HP. This effect lasts until her shield begins to recharge, decaying until the shield is back up to max capacity. We then have Death Do Us Part for 1 point, where enemies that are killed by an imbued ally have a 40% increased chance to husk. And A Little Good for 5 points. Nadifa gains 5 to 25% team shield capacity and recharge rate. On to tier 3, we have Necrotic Munitions for 3 points, which causes the next magazine after Nadifa casts her action still to gain 50 to 150% bonus damage of her attuned element. Additionally, these shots can pierce through enemies, dealing 60% damage to subsequent enemies after the initial enemy hit, but applying a guaranteed status effect dealing 100% bonus status effect damage. Potent Medicine for 1 point, which is a siren power, which causes imbued subjects to radiate a damaging aura of Nadifa's attuned element. And then Parasite for 5 points. For each current ally, Nadifa and those allies gain 1 to 5% overall damage. This bonus is doubled while her action still is active. This, of course, in solo play between an imbued ally and the Phoenix from Spellcraft can be up to a 10% damage boost. Over in multiplayer with a full lobby, this is a 15% damage boost for everyone, but can also be up to a 25% if, of course, you're running Imbue and a Phoenix. So this is an incredibly variable skill, however, it does have very specific situations where it can be incredibly good, and as it is overall damage, if you can get some even decent numbers out of this, this will definitely be quite a solid damage boost. And to tier 4, we have Sunder for 5 points, which causes enemies afflicted with an elemental status effect to take 1 to 5% increased damage from all sources per status effect applied to them. And Ferocious Focus for 1 point, which is a siren power itself, but boosts all other siren power abilities. Potent Medicine gets an increase to its aura size and damage. Dark Effigy, which we'll get to in a second, gains increased area size, and the mark bonuses gain an additional 5% boost. Do It Myself, again, we'll get to that in a second, also gets an increase to the mark bonuses by 15%. Volatile Concoction gets increased explosion damage. Force of Will gets an increase to its radius. Spellcraft gets a 25% increase to grenade damage. Agony gets an additional 2% healing. The Tentacles of Wings of Wrath will lash out more often. And for Rage and Grace, Rage deals increased damage while Grace's cooldown is reduced by 10 seconds. And on a tier 5, we start with Carnage for 5 points. Dealing damage grants Nadifa stacks of Carnage, decaying rapidly with a max stack count of 5 to 15. Stacks grant 1% weapon swap speed, 2% reload speed, and 2% magazine size. Hand That Feeds for 3 points. Nadifa loses 10 to 30% of her max HP when she imbues an enemy. The imbued enemy berserks, gaining increased damage, fire rate, melee speed, and movement speed. Now, I didn't know what to make the numbers here, however, the numbers would scale higher with the amount of points that you put in. She wouldn't just be losing more HP for no bonus whatsoever. And finally for this tier, Dark Effigy for 1 point. This is a siren power and a melee override still. Nadifa tosses out an effigy, costing 20% of her current HP and creating a small radius surrounding it which heals herself and allies within, scaling off action still boosts. If thrown at a downed ally, consume the effigy to instantly revive them. The effigy gains bonus effects based on the equipped mark. Mark of the Jabber, allies within the radius gain increased shield recharge speed, 15% bonus weapon damage, and 50% bonus jump height. Mark of the Saurian, allies within the radius gain bonus melee damage, 35% damage reduction, and 15% bonus movement speed. And Mark of the Swamp Queen, the radius is increased and allies within gain 20% bonus elemental damage, while enemies within are slowed by 15%. And finally to the capstone, Do It Myself for, of course, 1 point. This is also a siren power. Nadifa can hold F, channeling Imbue onto herself. While imbued, Nadifa gains the bonuses of her equipped mark, but also takes constant damage of her attuned element, increasing in damage the longer longer she is imbued. Imbue can be ended early by pressing F again. And those are all of Nadifa's skill trees. So now let's finish off with some class mods. Starting with Bog Bath. Dealing action skill damage has a chance to coat enemies in sludge. Incendiary and corrosive damage dealt to sludged enemies gains increased damage and longer lasting status effects, while shock and radiation damage has reduced damage and status effect duration. Bonfire causing agony healing to be reduced by 50% for Nadifa, but rejuvenation being increased by 300% for allies. Caster causes husk bombs to deal decreased damage but explode quicker and leave behind a copy of Nadifa's equipped grenade mod. Additionally, the siren power of spellcraft is increased, which again is a 25% grenade damage boost to spellcrafted grenades. Domineer, Nadifa can imbue her allies, ending when they enter fight for your life. The imbued ally will take a constant damage over time effect of Nadifa's attuned element, which increases in strength the longer they are imbued. The imbued ally will share a much larger portion of Nadifa's self-healing. Additionally, Nadifa can imbue an ally already in fight for your life to instantly grant them second wind and imbue them. Imbued allies share the same traits as imbued enemies. This does mean that they get any other bonuses that affect imbued enemies, and also gain the effects of Nadifa's equipped mark except for the bonus health bars. However, if any mark other than the jabber is equipped, then the imbued ally's primary fire will be replaced with a more rapid melee. Allies cannot use their action skills while imbued. Hex gives your status effects the ability to store a critical hit. Status effect critical hits deal 2 times damage and grant 1.5 times healing from Leech. Masochist, all damage dealt by Nadifa is increased based on how much damage she has taken in the last 13 seconds. The max damage bonus is granted after surviving 600% of her max HP for a 30% increase to all damage dealt. And finally, Mutant. Nadifa's shield capacity is set to 0, but she gains 60% increased max HP, 30% damage reduction, 25% weapon damage, and constantly heals for 5% of her equipped shield's recharge rate.
Nadifa's teeth sink into the flesh of the corpse of what was once a powerful monster, locked away to the danger it posed if allowed to roam free. Destruction, despair, and carnage was all it had brought. A power so unholy, a long-lost race made it their sole mission to keep it, and monsters like it, held away. Nadifa's tattoos began to glow a deep red as they extended further across her skin, burning their way through it like rivers of magma. Her tattoos had long lost their once beautiful patterns. The lines and shapes of her original markings now led into dark, vein-like tendrils spiderwebbing across her body. Wounds from the battle slowly healed as the creature's power and life was drained. Nadifa's skin knitting back together over deep gashes and dark bruises slowly fading into nothingness. She would stand as the once menacing alien beast began to fade away into nothing but dust below her, looking almost pathetic as its body's form dematerialized. Nadifa, watching with a proud grin, the monster's blood dripping from her mouth. Nadifa looked towards the sky, feeling the sun on her skin as she closed her eyes. She'd done it. She'd saved the universe alongside this ragtag group of mercenaries in the backing of what barely could be called an army. Yet all she could think about was how badly she wanted more. More violence, bloodshed, war, more power. It was a fire within her. A feeling of being burned from the inside out, aching to find and destroy another vault. Nadifa would turn and walk back to the group, bringing an arm up to wipe away the blood from her mouth. She noticed the echoing silence, but more than that, their expressions. It was no different to how they looked at the monster when it had emerged from the vault.
And that is Nadifa the Siren. This video has been in the works in the background for literally like almost 7 months at this point. It was all the way back at my first randomizer stream where I talked about my ideas for a playable PHASELEECH Siren. And since then, I've been working on and off just coming up with stills and coming up with these assets for this video and story and just getting really into it. And I'm really happy with how it turned out. I'd also like to once again give a massive thanks to Sarah for the wonderful art piece. And again, and suggest that you go follow her on Instagram at MixSwoons. Link down in the description to that. Also a big thanks to Ivy, as her voiceover work was far better than mine. And down in the description will also be a link to her Twitch channel, PoisonIvy_0213. And a final huge thanks to anyone who actually watched the entirety of this video. As I said, a hell of a lot of work went into this video, and it is probably the video that I am the most proud of yet. So again, thank you for watching. And you know, if you like this video, I would greatly appreciate maybe a like, comment, subscribe, sending this to your friends, your mom, your dad. I don't fucking know. I don't own you. You do whatever the fuck you want with your life. However, it would be very greatly appreciated. Along with the links to Sarah and Ivy though, down in the description will be a link to my Twitch channel where I'll be live right after this video goes up, and just below that is a link to my Discord server where you can come and join and hang out. But with that all being said, I hope to see you guys in the next one.